The first explosion came without warning. A German Panzer tank, 45 tons of steel and arrogance, vanished in a flash of orange light. Major Otto Hartmann, one of Germany's most decorated Panzer aces, stared through his binoculars in disbelief. Smoke. Silence. Then another blast. A second Panther shredded open like paper. "Return fire!" he shouted. But there was nothing to shoot at. No muzzle flash. No enemy silhouette, just the whisper of wind over wheat. Hartmann slammed the radio button. "Where are they?" His gunner answered, panicked. "It moved! I swear it moved! Like lightning!" For the first time in years, the major felt something he hadn't since the Eastern Front. Fear. Then came the killing blow. A shell tearing through the command tank. When the fire settled, the only trace of the attacker was a trail of tire tracks disappearing into the mist. Hartmann's last recorded words before losing consciousness were simple. That wasn't a tank. That was a ghost. The German army had seen Shermans, Churchills, and Cromwells. They had mocked them all. But what they met that day was different. An American machine that could vanish at 55 miles per hour. It was called the M18 Hellcat, the fastest armored fighting vehicle of World War II. The U.S. Army labeled it a tank destroyer, but the men who rode it knew better. It was a gamble on wheels, a weapon that traded armor for speed, fear for motion. German intelligence had dismissed it as madness. "No armor, open turret, paper sides. It's a coffin with an engine," one officer said. But soon, those same men would be watching their panzers burn, struck by an enemy too fast to see. This is the story of the M18 Hellcat, the reckless, roaring, impossible machine that defied every rule of armored warfare and every instinct of survival. In the hands of ordinary soldiers, it became more than a vehicle. It became proof that sometimes the fastest way to survive is to never stop moving. The Germans had built fortresses. America built speed. And speed, as they were about to learn, kills. In 1943, American generals faced a question that divided the army. How do you stop a tank you can't outgun? The German panzers had thicker armor, heavier cannons, and a reputation for invincibility. The U.S. response was unconventional. Don't outgun them, outrun them. It sounded insane. In a war obsessed with armor and firepower, the very idea of a lightweight, high-speed tank destroyer was heresy. Traditionalists in Washington scoffed. "A tank's first job," one colonel barked, "is to survive a hit." But the engineers at Buick had a different creed. Don't get hit at all. At the Detroit Tank Arsenal, rows of engineers and mechanics worked day and night, sketching, cutting, and welding. They borrowed ideas from racing cars, not from tanks. One of them, a young test driver, put it simply: armor slows you down, fear slows you more. The first prototypes looked fragile: thin armor, open turret, a small gun compared to the German beasts. Soldiers joked it would be safer to ride a jeep into battle. But behind the laughter was a question that no one could yet answer. Could pure speed defeat pure power? At testing grounds in Michigan, generals watched as the new vehicle roared across the field. Faster than any armored machine they had ever seen, it leapt ditches, skidded around obstacles, and hit targets at full speed. The stopwatch told the story: 0 to 30 miles per hour in under 9 seconds. When the test ended, the field commander muttered, "It's not a tank, it's a ghost." The designers called it the M18 Hellcat. Its philosophy was as American as the factories that built it. Risk everything, trust the driver, and make up the rules as you go. It wasn't built to trade shots with a tiger. It was built to appear, kill, and disappear. The German High Command dismissed it. Their reports mocked the American toy tank, calling it suicidal and naive. But deep inside the Allied command, some officers sensed its potential. The war had reached a point where imagination mattered more than convention. The Hellcat wasn't just a machine, it was a message. America would fight this war on its own terms. A young lieutenant watching the tests wrote in his diary, It looks like a sports car pretending to be a weapon. But when you see it move, you realize it doesn't need armor. It's made of nerve. That nerve would soon be tested in Normandy, where steel met mud, and the world's fastest tank destroyer would have to prove that speed could be deadlier than armor. In the months ahead, the German army would learn that the Americans had created something they didn't understand, a machine that didn't fight the way tanks were supposed to fight. It didn't hold ground. It didn't duel. It hunted. And when it struck, it left nothing but burning wrecks and tire tracks fading into the fog. The M18 Hellcat was born not in a laboratory or a grand design bureau, but on the shop floors of American industry. Buick, the same company that once made family cars, became one of the unlikely engines of destruction. Its workers, many of them women and young men too old or too young for the draft, built the fastest tank destroyer in the world in less than 2 years. Every morning, factory whistles echoed through Flint, Michigan. Conveyor belts hummed. Welding sparks lit the dark corners of the plant like miniature thunderstorms. Above the roar of machinery, a supervisor shouted, "Keep them light! Keep them fast!" That mantra guided the design. Every ounce of unnecessary steel stripped away. Every curve designed for motion, not armor. Inside the plant, the workers knew what they were doing mattered. They painted the words "For the Boys" on the inside of turret plates before bolting them shut. Others slipped notes into ammo boxes, small reminders that behind every machine was a human story. The Hellcat's heart was its engine, a radial aircraft engine adapted for ground warfare. It screamed like a fighter plane and could push the tank destroyer to 55 miles per hour on open ground. Soldiers who later drove it said it didn't sound like a tank at all. It sounded alive. Its 76-millimeter gun, though smaller than the massive cannons of German Tigers, had precision and speed on its side. Fired from a moving Hellcat, the shell could pierce armor at 1,000 yards before the enemy even rotated its turret. A military mechanic who tested the prototype said, "It's not a tank, it's a scalpel. You don't use it to bash, you use it to cut." In May 1943, the first production models rolled off the line. Each cost around $57,000, cheap, fast, and deadly. The Army ordered thousands. By 1944, M18s were rolling through ports toward the battlefields of Europe. Back in Germany, engineers studying captured intelligence laughed at the specifications. Open turret? No side armor? Exposed crew? Impossible. This is suicide on tracks. But they didn't understand that suicide wasn't the plan. Momentum was. The Hellcat would rely on agility and coordination, on radio chatter and teamwork, on surprise rather than brute strength. A veteran of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion later recalled, "They told us we were bait with a gun, but when you're moving that fast, you don't feel like bait, you feel like the hunter." The Hellcat wasn't just an engineering marvel, it was a psychological weapon. Its speed let it appear out of nowhere, fire, and vanish before the enemy could react. It could race along flanks, hit supply lines, or ambush from behind cover. Germans who first faced it in Normandy swore they were fighting dozens of tanks, when in truth, it was often just 2 or 3 Hellcats striking from different angles. The design had its flaws. Its open turret left crews exposed to snipers and shrapnel. Its thin armor could be pierced by even small-caliber rounds. But the crews learned that survival didn't come from protection. It came from motion, teamwork, and precision. One commander summed it up in a letter home. "We don't fight the German tanks, we outthink them. And that's how you live." The Hellcat was ready. The factories had done their part. Now it was time for the soldiers to test whether America's fastest weapon could outrun death itself. June 1944. Normandy was burning. Smoke rolled across the hedgerows, and the smell of cordite and damp earth clung to every breath. The M18 Hellcats arrived not with fanfare, but with a whisper, the hum of engines fine-tuned like race cars, ready to prove their worth in a land built for ambushes. Lieutenant Frank Malloy of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion still remembered his first encounter with the German armor. "We were kids sitting in tin cans," he said years later. "Then the ground started shaking. We heard the Tigers coming before we saw them. The German Tigers and Panthers were monsters. 45 tons of steel, their armor nearly impervious to frontal attacks. The Hellcats, barely armored themselves, seemed absurd by comparison. But the Americans didn't plan to meet the Tigers head-on. They had something else in mind. Malloy's unit took up a hidden position behind a stone farmhouse overlooking a narrow road. Through his binoculars, he saw the German column advancing, 2 Tigers, a Panther, and a convoy of infantry trucks. "If they spot us," his gunner muttered, "we're done." The order came down the radio. "Wait until they pass, then move." As the last truck rolled by, Malloy's driver hit the throttle. The Hellcat leapt forward like a predator breaking from cover. Within seconds, it was flying down a parallel dirt road, engine howling, turret swinging to line up the rear Tiger. "Range 800, shouted the gunner. "Fire!" The 76mm cannon cracked, and the shell tore through the Tiger's rear armor like paper. The massive tank exploded in flames, scattering the infantry into chaos. Before the second Tiger could turn its turret, the Hellcat was already gone, vanished into the hedgerows, leaving only smoke and confusion behind. German reports later described the attack as coordinated by dozens of light tanks. In truth, it had been a single platoon of Hellcats moving faster than the enemy could think. Malloy's battalion repeated this pattern for weeks. Hit, vanish, hit again. They never stayed still. Every engagement was a dance of motion and nerve. The Germans tried to trap them, setting ambushes along the roads. But by the time the traps were sprung, the Hellcats were already somewhere else. A captured German officer later admitted, "We thought we were fighting ghosts. They came out of nowhere, destroyed everything, and disappeared before we could react." The Hellcat's radio coordination was its secret weapon. Crews operated in perfect sync, calling positions, adjusting fire, covering retreats. Every tank destroyer knew exactly where its partners were, creating the illusion of an entire armored division. By August, the 705th had destroyed over 70 German tanks with minimal losses. One after-action report described the results in cold military terms. Enemy armor neutralized. Hellcat mobility decisive. But the men who fought in them told it differently. They said the Hellcat made them feel like they were riding thunder. For the Germans, it was a nightmare they couldn't counter. Their heavy tanks were powerful but slow, designed for duels of strength. Against the Hellcat's hit-and-run tactics, they were like boxers punching at smoke. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy, the M18 earned a new reputation, one that terrified German tankers. They called it der Höllenkatze, the Hellcat. It was fast, fearless, and impossible to catch. In the fields of France, the myth of invincible German armor finally began to crack. The machine that had been mocked as suicidal was proving unstoppable. And for the first time, the hunters of Europe realized they were the ones being hunted. War is numbers long before it is glory. And in 1944, the math was turning against Germany. The Panzer divisions, once the pride of the Reich, were being outproduced, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted. The M18 Hellcat didn't just represent speed, it represented a new equation for survival. Each Hellcat was cheaper, faster to build, and easier to repair than any German tank it faced. While it took Germany months to build a single Panther, American factories could roll out a dozen Hellcats in the same time. "They can afford to lose them," one German officer wrote bitterly. "We can't afford to lose one." That was the secret the Hellcat embodied. Efficiency over elegance, simplicity over perfection. Its thin armor wasn't a flaw, it was a choice. Armor could only protect you once. Speed could save you every time. Crews quickly learned that to survive in a Hellcat, you had to think in motion. Never stop, never wait. If the enemy sees you, you're already too late. Gunner Corporal Louis Baker summed it up best. "You drive it like you stole it, or you die." During the Battle of Ardennes in September 1944, this math of survival was tested on a massive scale. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion faced off against the elite 111th Panzer Brigade. The Germans had the advantage: better armor, longer guns, more experience. But they didn't have the Hellcats' mobility. As fog rolled across the French countryside, the Hellcats waited in ambush. Their engines idled quietly behind hedgerows. When the fog lifted, the battlefield erupted. The Panzers advanced confidently, their commanders unaware that they were already being surrounded. The Hellcats struck like lightning, emerging from the mist, firing, and darting away before return fire could find them. German commanders shouted over the radio, "They're everywhere! Surround them!" But by the time reinforcements arrived, the Hellcats had vanished. In one day, 22 German tanks were destroyed for the loss of only 4 Hellcats. The ratio, more than 5 to 1, became legend. A report from General Patton's staff later read, "The M18's speed nullifies German superiority. It is the only vehicle that can dictate the terms of engagement." To the Americans, the Hellcat was no longer just a tank destroyer. It was a philosophy made of steel, a belief that war could be won through adaptability, not armor thickness. German prisoners who were captured after Ardennes described the attacks with disbelief. "We could not understand," one said. "Your tanks appeared where no road existed. They were behind us before we knew you were near." That was the power of American logistics. The Hellcat didn't win because it was faster. It won because it could move farther, stay supplied longer, and be repaired quicker than anything the enemy possessed. Inside the vehicle, the crew lived by seconds. The driver's knuckles were white on the controls, the gunner's breath timed to the recoil of the cannon, the commander shouting coordinates into the radio like a conductor leading a symphony of steel and speed. The Hellcat taught an entire generation of soldiers a brutal truth. Survival wasn't about who had the thickest armor. It was about who could rewrite the math before the enemy caught up. For every German tank destroyed, for every ambush that ended in smoke and wreckage, the men in the M18 proved that sometimes survival wasn't luck. It was design. And in that design lay the future of modern warfare. December 1944. The Ardennes forest was buried in snow, and the German counterattack had torn through the Allied lines like a knife through canvas. Bastogne, a small Belgian town, stood at the center of the chaos. Surrounded and freezing, the men of the 101st Airborne were holding out. But if the roads fell, so would Bastogne. The only armor available to cover the retreat was a handful of M18 Hellcats. Lieutenant William Rees of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion got the order just before dawn. "Hold the road, no retreat." He glanced at his crew. 5 exhausted men in a vehicle barely armored enough to stop rifle fire. "Hold it with what?" his driver muttered. Rees's answer was simple: with speed. The Hellcats positioned themselves along the snowy ridgeline overlooking the road. Visibility was poor, the cold biting through gloves and uniforms. Then they heard it, the deep growl of German engines echoing through the forest. Tigers and Panthers advancing in formation. "Contact front!" the gunner shouted. Rees raised his binoculars. The German armor looked unstoppable, black silhouettes against the white snow. But the Hellcat had one thing the Tigers didn't: momentum. "Range 900, load armor piercing." The first shot hit a Panther square in the side. Flames burst from its hatches. Before the second tank could react, the Hellcat reversed behind cover, snow spraying from its treads. The Germans returned fire, their shells smashing into the ridge, but the Hellcats were already gone, repositioning down the slope for another strike. For 2 hours, the fight became a deadly dance. The Hellcats darted between tree lines, firing and vanishing like phantoms. German commanders tried to flank, but every time they advanced, another American shell ripped through their armor. One gunner later described it: "We weren't fighting tanks, we were fighting gravity, frost, and fear." But the Hellcat didn't care about any of it. That thing moved like it was alive. When reinforcements finally arrived, the road was littered with burning wrecks. 6 German tanks destroyed, only 1 Hellcat lost. Rees's vehicle, its barrel glowing red-hot, had fired 47 rounds in 3 hours. That defense gave Bastogne the time it needed. The paratroopers dug in, supplies arrived, and the siege was broken days later. When reporters asked the soldiers what saved them, one airborne sergeant simply said, "Some crazy tank destroyer boys who refused to sit still." The German reports told a different story: confusion, panic, disbelief. They described American light tanks operating with impossible coordination and mobility. They couldn't comprehend that what they had faced wasn't a new superweapon, but a handful of ordinary men in fast machines who refused to play by the rules. After the war, a German officer who had fought at Bastogne admitted, "We thought speed was reckless. We learned it was genius." The road to Bastogne proved the Hellcat's philosophy in blood and snow. Its crews didn't rely on protection. They relied on movement, precision, and courage. They fought like fencers, not brawlers. When Lieutenant Reese wrote home after the battle, he didn't mention the destroyed tanks or the medals. He wrote about his crew. They were cold, hungry, and terrified. But not one of them hesitated. "We didn't save Bastogne because we were brave. We did it because we were fast." That speed became legend. The kind of legend that turned a paper tank into one of the most feared machines of the war. March 1945. The city of Cologne stood in ruins, its cathedral spires rising like blackened fingers above the smoke. German resistance was collapsing, but in the shattered streets, danger still prowled. The 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion was ordered to clear the city's western sector, and to do it fast. Among them was Sergeant Harold Red Lawson, commander of a single M18 Hellcat that would soon write its name into legend. As dawn broke, the Hellcat crept through the rubble-strewn avenues. Every corner could hide a Panther. Every echo could be a gunner's last. Lawson leaned out of the turret, scanning the windows. "Keep your eyes up," he told his crew. "They're not done yet." The radio crackled. A patrol had spotted a Panther lying in wait near the Cathedral Plaza. The German crew had perfect cover, a clear line of fire down a main avenue. No Sherman or infantry unit could advance until that tank was neutralized. "Orders are to hold back," Lawson's driver warned. "They'll chew us up out there." Lawson thought for a moment, then grinned. "If we wait, they'll hit the column. We move now." The Hellcat roared forward, engines screaming, its open turret shaking as the vehicle bounced over debris. It accelerated to 40 miles an hour in the narrow street, impossible for any other armored vehicle. "They'll never expect it," Lawson shouted. The Panther's gun flashed. The shells screamed past, obliterating a storefront. The blast wave slammed into the Hellcat's side, but Lawson didn't stop. "Faster!" he yelled. His driver jammed the throttle, pushing the M18 to 50. At 200 yards, the gunner took aim. "Now!" Lawson barked. The 76mm gun fired. The shot hit the Panther's turret ring, sparks exploding as the German tank shuddered to a halt. Before the enemy could react, the Hellcat swung around, fired again, and the Panther erupted in flame. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the plaza was silent except for the crackle of burning fuel. The infantry, stunned, advanced behind the speeding Hellcat, cheering. "The Juggernaut just smoked a Panther," one shouted. Lawson's tank was hit twice later that day by shrapnel and small arms fire, but it kept fighting, destroying 2 anti-tank guns and covering an entire company's advance. When his crew finally stopped for fuel, they discovered that the thin aluminum armor on the hull had been pierced, but none of the rounds had struck the crew. One of his men later said, "That tank shouldn't have survived, but when Red drove, it felt like even death couldn't catch us." After Cologne was secured, war correspondents captured footage of the battle. The clip would later become famous, the scene of a Panther exploding under the guns of an American tank destroyer. Few realized that the machine in the footage wasn't a Sherman at all. It was Lawson's Hellcat. German survivors of the battle told interrogators that the attack felt inhumanly fast, One described it as a flash of movement and then fire everywhere. The M18's reputation grew from stories like Cologne. Crews across Europe began painting small black cat emblems on their vehicles, the symbol of the Hellcat division. It became more than a weapon. It became a mark of pride, proof that skill and daring could defy even the strongest enemy. By the time the war reached Germany's heartland, the Hellcat had claimed over 500 armored kills. Its record, 5 enemy tanks destroyed for every one lost, was unmatched. And through it all, its crews repeated the same phrase scrawled on the sides of their turrets: "Speed is armor." By April 1945, Germany's once mighty Panzer force was collapsing under the sheer weight of Allied speed and firepower. But what truly broke their spirit wasn't the number of tanks lost, it was the math of defeat. A Tiger tank cost over 250,000 Reichsmarks to build. It required 20 tons of high-grade steel, and each one took months to produce. A Hellcat cost a fraction of that and rolled off assembly lines every day. Germany's factories were burning. America's were running 3 shifts around the clock. Major Erich Müller, one of the few surviving Panzer officers, wrote later from captivity, "We fought battles of pride. The Americans fought battles of production. We were already dead before we knew it." On the battlefield, the numbers told the same story. Where the Germans fielded 20 tanks, the Allies fielded 100 armored vehicles of all kinds: Shermans, Hellcats, half-tracks, and Jeeps. The skies were filled with Thunderbolts and Mustangs. The math was merciless, and the Hellcat was its sharpest equation. At the Rhine crossings, Hellcat crews were ordered to race ahead of advancing infantry, intercepting retreating German columns. They didn't ambush anymore. They chased. The hunters had become the hunted. German tank crews who once laughed at the tin cans now abandoned their vehicles at the sound of a distant Hellcat engine. A captured German mechanic confessed, "We heard that whining engine and froze. It wasn't just a tank. It was a rumor of death." For the Americans, victory came not from perfection, but from momentum. Every Hellcat was a moving part in a vast machine: factories, rail lines, supply chains, and the soldiers who made it all work. The Germans were still fighting a tactical war. America was fighting an industrial one. Captain James Holloway of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion described it simply. "We didn't fight the German tanks, we overwhelmed them. Our speed wasn't just on the ground. It was in our fuel trucks, our radios, our air cover. Everything moved faster." That speed had consequences. Hellcat crews paid in exhaustion and fear. Many never made it home. Thin armor meant that any mistake could turn the vehicle into a coffin. But still they advanced, driven by the certainty that their motion, constant, relentless, was the only thing keeping the enemy off balance. One after-action report from April 12, 1945 summarized the final stage of the tank war with chilling precision. Enemy unable to maneuver. Hellcats strike from 3 directions simultaneously. Morale disintegrating. Captured crews abandoned tanks without fight. The German command tried to adapt. They laid ambushes in narrow streets, mined crossroads, and sent Panzerfaust teams into the woods. But the Hellcats were never where they were expected to be. Their radio coordination allowed them to hit and fade before the traps could spring. As Germany's front lines crumbled, the Hellcats rolled faster than ever, crossing bridges, smashing through villages, chasing retreating columns that no longer had the strength to turn and fight. At one crossroads near Kassel, an old German colonel surrendered his last Panther without firing a shot. He looked at the American officer and said, "You built too many. You moved too fast. We could not fight math." That single sentence became the quiet truth of the war. The Hellcat was never the biggest or the strongest, but it was the product of a nation that understood something more powerful than armor or steel: speed, numbers, will. That was the math of victory and the arithmetic of collapse. When the smoke of Europe's battlefields finally cleared, the M18 Hellcat stood as one of the most effective and least understood machines of the war. It had been built in haste, doubted by generals and mocked by the enemy. Yet in the end, it proved that speed, daring, and adaptability could destroy the myth of invincibility that surrounded German armor. The final tallies told the story with cold precision. Hellcat units achieved some of the highest kill-to-loss ratios in armored warfare history, 5-to-1, sometimes even 10-to-1. Their success was not born from brute force, but from something far rarer in war: ingenuity. The German Tigers and Panthers had been designed for duels of strength and pride. The Hellcat was designed for survival and initiative. Its crews were not ordered to hold the line. They were told to find the enemy's weakness and exploit it. It was an American weapon in the purest sense, unorthodox, fast, fearless, and built by people who believed that boldness could make up for anything. One veteran later said, "The Hellcat wasn't the strongest thing on the battlefield, but it was the smartest." And that intelligence, mechanical and human, was what broke the back of German armor. When American soldiers returned home, they spoke about the Hellcat not with awe, but with affection. They called it the racer, the thunder, the cat that never slept. For them, it wasn't just a machine. It was a companion that had carried them through the worst days of their lives. In Germany, the story was different. Captured Panzer crews wrote reports filled with disbelief. "The Americans fought like they had no fear," one officer said. "Their tanks came from nowhere. They were gone before we could aim." Those words captured what the Hellcat represented: a new kind of warfare, one defined by mobility, not might. It foreshadowed the future: tanks that relied on precision, coordination, and information rather than sheer armor thickness. Historians would later call the M18 Hellcat a bridge between two eras. It was the last great expression of mechanical simplicity, and the first glimpse of modern, rapid, networked warfare. Its crews fought not as isolated gunners, but as a moving system, connected by radios, timing, and trust. A surviving Hellcat today sits in a museum, its olive paint faded, its open turret showing the scars of combat. Visitors often marvel at how small it is, how exposed the crew must have been. But if you listen to the veterans who served in it, they'll tell you something else: that those thin walls held some of the bravest hearts in the war. Because courage was the true armor of the Hellcat. The belief that movement could defy death, that being outnumbered didn't mean being outthought. That even in a world ruled by machines, the human spirit could still rewrite the rules of survival. When one former German tank commander was asked decades later what he thought of the Hellcat, he smiled grimly. "It wasn't fair," he said. "They moved faster than fear." The legend of the Hellcat endures not because it was perfect, but because it was impossible. And somehow, impossibility won. In the end, the M18 Hellcat was more than a tank destroyer. It was a statement. A declaration that ingenuity could triumph over intimidation, that speed could outthink strength, and that courage could outpace fear. Long after the war, historians and engineers would look back at the Hellcat as one of the purest expressions of the American war philosophy. Fight smart, move fast, and never stop adapting. While Germany perfected heavy armor, America perfected motion. The Hellcat embodied that idea in every bolt, gear, and scream of its engine. At 55 miles per hour, it was the fastest armored vehicle of World War II, a machine that could run circles around any enemy tank. But what made it truly dangerous wasn't its velocity. It was the people behind it. Young crews, barely out of high school, who learned to read the terrain like chess players, to strike from shadows, and to trust one another completely. Sergeant Harold Red Lawson, whose daring charge in Cologne became the stuff of legend, summed it up best in a letter written after the war. "We weren't faster because we wanted to be heroes. We were faster because we had to live." In post-war America, many of those Hellcat crews returned to ordinary lives. They worked in factories, drove trucks, and raised families. But in every town reunion, in every Veterans Hall gathering, the same stories would resurface. The roar of the engine, the rush of a hit-and-run strike, the feeling of being untouchable for just one heartbeat. And for the German veterans who faced them, the memory was just as vivid. One Panzer commander admitted decades later, "We called them ghosts. You never saw them coming until you were already burning." The Hellcat's legacy didn't end in 1945. Its design principles, speed, agility, coordination, shaped future generations of combat vehicles. The U.S. military learned that wars are not always won by heavier armor or bigger guns, but by how quickly a force can adapt. From the Korean War to modern rapid strike tactics, the DNA of the Hellcat can still be felt. Even today, in museums and reenactments, when the M18's radial engine comes to life, the crowd always gasps. It's not just nostalgia, it's recognition. A sound that once carried across battlefields as both warning and promise. The Hellcat was America's answer to a world that had lost faith in the speed of good. It reminded everyone that the future belongs to those who move. In the quiet of the Texas plains, where one restored Hellcat rests, its paint chipped and its tracks dusted by time, a small plaque reads, "Speed is armor. Courage is victory." That phrase captures everything the Hellcat stood for. It wasn't invincible, but it was relentless. It wasn't beautiful, but it was effective. It was a machine born from necessity and elevated by the will of the men who drove it straight into the storm. So when we talk about the great weapons of World War II, we remember the Tigers, the Shermans, the Mustangs. But somewhere between them, leaner, faster, hungrier, raced the Hellcat. The tank destroyer that proved a simple truth. You don't have to be the biggest force on the battlefield to change its outcome. You just have to be the fastest to act, and brave enough to never stop moving. "Wars are won by movement," Lawson once said, and no one moved like the Hellcat.